By Monday, the whispers had turned into policy. Miles heard them first in the elevator, a conversation that stopped just short of silence when he stepped in. Conflicted, compromised, managed. The words weren't accusations, they were conclusions. By the time he reached his floor, 3 meetings had been rescheduled without notice, and one of his project, was suddenly under new review. Victoria's assistant avoided his eyes. Grant Whitford didn't. "Optics matter, Hill," Grant said casually over coffee. "You can't lead a billion-dollar initiative when your fiancé is making headlines for buying boutique companies. It looks unbalanced." Miles clenched his jaw. Brooklyn isn't a headline. She's a person. Grant smiled like a man explaining math to a child. "Sure. But markets don't care about people." That was Halberton's gospel, and Miles had believed it once. Now, every repetition of it felt like a betrayal, not of the company, but of himself. He defended her again at the next strategy session when a director muttered something about conflicts of interest. Victoria's voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. "Miles, you're too close to this situation. Let's reassign the rollout to someone with distance." The room was quiet enough to hear the sound of his future shrinking. He wanted to protest, to explain that distance wasn't integrity, it was cowardice. But Victoria had already turned the page. By 5, his bonus had been reconsidered, his calendar cleared, and his ambition neatly boxed in the name of neutrality. When he left the building, rain was falling in thin, relentless lines, the kind that made the world blur at the edges. He drove through the city without turning on the radio, the ring of his phone lighting up with messages from colleagues offering sympathy that felt like surveillance. Brooklyn's building glowed faintly through the downpour, every window a promise of warmth. When she opened the door, he looked like a man caught between exhaustion and apology, hair damp, eyes hollow. "It's bad," he said simply, setting his briefcase down like a confession. "They're questioning my objectivity, my judgment, everything." Brooklyn handed him a towel, her movements deliberate, unhurried. "And what did you tell them?" she asked. "That they're wrong. That this will pass." She looked at him for a long moment, the rain whispering against the glass. "No," she said softly, her voice like calm before a storm. "It won't pass, Miles. It will reveal." He exhaled, the truth of it settling in the space between them. Outside, thunder rolled, low, inevitable, and close. The city was still asleep when Brooklyn began to move. Her penthouse lights glowed against the dark skyline, the hum of her espresso machine the only sound breaking the quiet before dawn. On the marble counter lay a single folder embossed with gold, Project Aurora. Inside it was the tender offer that would change everything, not an attack, but a reflection. She wasn't coming for Halberton with anger, she was coming with accuracy. Her proposal wasn't emotional, it was mathematical. It showed the shareholders exactly what they had, a bloated company clinging to relevance, and what they could have if someone with vision held the wheel. She didn't have to convince them, she only had to show them the mirror. By 5 a.m., her counsel Ezra Cole was on the line from London, voice steady and sharp. "Your timing's perfect," he said. "Asia's awake, and so is the market." Zuri Banks updated the model in real time, the offer terms unfolding like choreography. Brooklyn watched as the numbers translated into inevitability. "We're not buying them," she said. "We're saving them from themselves." Ezra chuckled, spoken like someone who's already won. When the markets opened, Halberton's stock twitched, small at first, then shuddering as the news spread. The whispers that had once mocked Brooklyn's ambition now turned into questions that made brokers sit up straighter. Who is Moore and Maven Holdings? How did we miss this play? She didn't grant interviews. She didn't gloat. She just let the data speak. At Halberton, Chaos had a sound, the click of heels and the rush of paper. Victoria Carlyle arrived in crimson silk, phone to her ear, her calm cracking at the edges. Call the board. Now she knew a precision strike when she saw one. Miles stood one floor below, frozen before the digital ticker as numbers turned red, then gold. The building felt smaller somehow, like the walls were drawing in around him. "She's making a move," Grant muttered from across the bullpen. "Your fiancé's staging a corporate coup." Miles didn't answer. He watched the candlestick chart climb like a sunrise, realizing this wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Brooklyn had turned strategy into art. Part of him felt awe. The other part, something heavier, fear that she was finally stepping into the full power the world had always tried to deny her. Upstairs, Brooklyn closed her laptop and exhaled. The first light of morning washed across her desk, gilding her coffee, her notes, her name. For once, she didn't need to chase credibility. The market had given its answer, and so had she. The boardroom smelled of power and panic, polished oak, fresh coffee, the faint metallic tang of fear. Halberton's executives had gathered like nervous shareholders in their own fate, the blinds half closed against the glare of morning. The ticker outside showed the market's verdict. Moore and Maven's tender offer had teeth. At the head of the table, Victoria Carlyle sat perfectly composed, her pen poised as if command alone could rewrite gravity. Grant Whitford whispered to Penelope Vance, his confidence leaking through forced laughter. Then the doors opened, and silence reigned. Brooklyn Moore walked in as if the floor itself belonged to her. Sable pantsuit, understated pearls, no entourage. Her presence didn't announce itself. It calibrated the room. Grant rose halfway, performing politeness. "Ms. Moore," he said, his grin all varnish. "Quite an entrance." She met his gaze, unmoved. "That depends on how you define exits," she replied, taking her seat. Penelope's phone buzzed under the table, the glow lighting her nervous fingers as Brooklyn unfolded a stack of papers and set them neatly before her. "I'm not here to dismantle Halberton," Brooklyn began, her voice even, precise. "I'm here to resurrect it." A murmur rippled across the table. She gestured to the projection behind her, spreadsheets and strategy layered in minimalist grace. "You have brilliance buried under bureaucracy, talent treated like overhead, contracts that drain instead of deliver. My proposal is simple. Divest the rot, elevate the crown jewels, give your engineers air, give your people ownership, and create an ethics council that answers to conscience, not convenience." Victoria leaned forward, her blue eyes cold and calculating. "We are not a carcass," she said, each word measured like currency. Brooklyn didn't blink. "No," she answered, her tone almost kind. "You're a sleeping giant that learned to dream in grayscale." "I'm just here to add the color back," Grant scoffed quietly. "You think you can outmaneuver legacy?" Brooklyn turned to him, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Legacy is just yesterday's innovation with better PR." Penelope looked down at her screen, pretending not to hear. Victoria glanced around the table, reading the shift in the air. The old guard was faltering, the new tide rising in silence. "Let's vote," she said finally. Papers shuffled, hands lifted, the motion passing like a quiet revolution. When it was over, Brooklyn gathered her notes. The word that had followed her from the Marlowe, gold digger, died quietly in that room, starved of oxygen and relevance. All that remained was the echo of her heels as she walked out, leaving behind numbers, nerve, and the undeniable sound of history turning. The announcement came at noon, quiet at first, like the pause before thunder. Halberton Systems, acquired by Moore and Maven Holdings. The words rippled through trading floors and newsrooms like an aftershock. Analysts scrambled for context, journalists sharpened their questions, and by the time the story reached the morning shows, Brooklyn Moore's name had become synonymous with precision. A woman who built her fortune on patience just outplayed a legacy corporation on its own chessboard. Outside Halberton's glass tower, cameras flared like heat lightning. Reporters filled the sidewalk, their voices layered into a chorus of speculation. Miles stood across the street, paper cup cooling in his hands, watching the building that had consumed a decade of his life. He could still see the window of his old office, the one where he'd stayed late, chasing approval that never arrived. He remembered the boardroom where they'd questioned his loyalty, the whispers that she had bought him, branded him, managed him. But now, as her name scrolled across the ticker above the entrance, the irony burned bright. Brooklyn hadn't married power. She'd become it. When the lobby doors opened, flashbulbs snapped like applause. Brooklyn stepped into daylight, calm and composed, the same poise she'd worn at the Marlowe months ago. Only now, no one dared to underestimate it. She moved through the chaos with unhurried grace, her heels striking marble like punctuation marks. A reporter shouted over the noise, "Miss Moore, was this personal? A revenge play?" Brooklyn's eyes flicked toward him, her voice smooth, deliberate. "I invest in potential," she said, "especially the kind people misname." Cameras clicked. Another voice called out, "What happens to Halberton now?" She smiled slightly. "It grows. Just differently." Inside the building, Victoria Carlyle watched from the mezzanine, her hand resting on the railing. Pride, regret, and something quieter, respect, moved across her face. She had seen dozens of takeovers, but none like this. Brooklyn hadn't arrived to dismantle. She'd arrived to evolve. Across the street, Miles exhaled, a strange ache rising in his chest. He wasn't part of her strategy, not anymore. But watching her now, he realized she had never needed saving, only space to unfold. The wind picked up, sweeping loose leaves across the pavement, carrying with it the sound of shutters, questions, and Brooklyn's voice echoing above them all. Steady, unapologetic, unstoppable. The thunder had come, not with noise but with clarity. And in its wake, the world finally adjusted its lens. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain against the window. Between them, on the marble island, the engagement ring lay like an artifact, neither promise nor possession, just a symbol waiting for meaning. Miles sat across from Brooklyn, elbows on the counter, sleeves rolled, eyes tired but clear. "I didn't defend you enough," he said finally. The words came low, heavy. "Every time they said your name like a punchline, I told myself staying silent was strategy. I thought I was protecting what I'd built." Brooklyn traced a fingertip around the edge of her coffee mug, not looking at him. "You were protecting your comfort," she said softly, "and I was protecting my pride. I built armor so strong you couldn't reach me even when you tried." She glanced up, meeting his gaze. "I wanted you to choose me over them," he exhaled, guilt and affection tangled in the same breath. "And I wanted to choose us without burning everything I worked for. But I see now, it's the same mistake. You can't serve two gods." The silence that followed wasn't sharp this time. It was thick with understanding, the kind that feels like surrender and beginning at once. Brooklyn looked at the ring again, its diamond catching the soft light from the window. "Do you still want this?" she asked. Miles followed her gaze. "I want you," he said. The ring was just proof I didn't know what that meant yet. She smiled faintly, a tired, genuine curve of the lips. "Then let's define it." She turned the ring slowly between her fingers. No more shrinking. No more performing. Not for them, not for each other. He nodded, his voice steady now. No more waiting to speak truth after the room clears. Brooklyn leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms as if weighing something invisible. Partnership, she said, almost to herself. Real partnership means we walk into rooms knowing who we are, even if the world hasn't caught up yet. Miles reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Then that's our contract, he said quietly. For a moment the rain intensified, streaking the windows with silver. Outside the city pulsed with movement, unaware of the quiet reconstruction happening inside. Brooklyn slid the ring back across the counter, not to reject it, but to reset it. If we go forward, she said, her tone both warning and invitation, we do it as equals. Miles met her eyes. Then we already are. The atrium of Halberton's systems no longer looked like a cathedral of hierarchy. Gone were the marble partitions that separated executives from engineers, the silent corners where ambition went to hide. Now the space pulsed with light and sound, screens alive with new prototypes, laughter weaving through the air like proof that the building could breathe again. Brooklyn stood at the center of it all, her presence steady but unassuming, as if she were conducting not a victory lap but a recalibration. The atrium of Halberton Systems no longer looked like a cathedral of hierarchy. Gone were the marble partitions that separated executives from engineers, the silent corners where ambition went to hide. Now the space pulsed with light and sound, screens alive with new prototypes, laughter weaving through the air like proof that the building could breathe again. Brooklyn stood at the center of it all, her presence steady but unassuming, as if she were conducting not a victory lap but a recalibration. Rows of chairs stretched across the floor, and for the first time, the front seats belonged not to suits, but to hoodies. The engineers who once whispered ideas into forgotten channels now sat where decisions were made. Zuri Banks, sharp and radiant in a coral blazer, stepped forward first. "This is not a restructure," she said. "It's a rebuild." Her presentation unfolded with the precision of a symphony. New project pipelines, transparent pay equity, mentorship paths that didn't end at the ceiling. Applause rose not from obligation but recognition. Then Ezra Cole took the stage, his voice calm and deliberate. "Governance," he said, "isn't just about compliance, it's about conscience." He outlined a new charter that tethered innovation to integrity, a system where no breakthrough came at the cost of dignity. The audience leaned forward, taking notes like believers relearning faith. Brooklyn followed last, her speech free of grandeur. "When I first walked into this building," she began, "I could feel the brilliance here. But brilliance suffocates when it's measured only in quarterly returns." She looked out over the crowd, faces once unseen, now luminous, with possibility. "So we're changing that. From this day forward, Halberton's success will be measured not just by what we make, but by what we make possible." She paused, then gestured toward the side of the stage. "And to help us do that," she continued, "I'm appointing someone who understands both sides of this journey, Miles Hill." There was a ripple of surprise, followed by applause. Miles walked out, wearing no tie, just quiet conviction. "I'll lead the product stewardship office," he said, "but it will answer to you, our employees, as much as the board. Accountability is partnership, not punishment." Cameras flashed, searching for drama, for the spark of redemption or rivalry. But what they captured instead was steadier, a black woman who had been called a gold digger standing at the helm of a company she once had to defend herself against. And instead of burning it down, she'd chosen to rebuild it, with grace, with courage, and with room for everyone inside. Rows of chairs stretched across the floor, and for the first time, the front seats belonged not to suits, but to hoodies. The engineers who once whispered ideas into forgotten channels now sat where decisions were made. Zuri Banks, sharp and radiant in a coral blazer, stepped forward first. "This is not a restructure," she said. "It's a rebuild." Her presentation unfolded with the precision of a symphony. New project pipelines, transparent pay equity, mentorship paths that didn't end at the ceiling. Applause rose not from obligation but recognition. Then Ezra Cole took the stage, his voice calm and deliberate. "Governance," he said, "isn't just about compliance, it's about conscience." He outlined a new charter that tethered innovation to integrity, a system where no breakthrough came at the cost of dignity. The audience leaned forward, taking notes like believers relearning faith. Brooklyn followed last, her speech free of grandeur. "When I first walked into this building," she began, "I could feel the brilliance here. But brilliance suffocates when it's measured only in quarterly returns." She looked out over the crowd, faces once unseen, now luminous with possibility. "So we're changing that. From this day forward, Halberton's success will be measured not just by what we make, but by what we make possible." She paused, then gestured toward the side of the stage. "And to help us do that," she continued, "I'm appointing someone who understands both sides of this journey, Miles Hill." There was a ripple of surprise, followed by applause. Miles walked out, wearing no tie, just quiet conviction. "I'll lead the product stewardship office," he said, "but it will answer to you, our employees, as much as the board. Accountability is partnership, not punishment." Cameras flashed, searching for drama, for the spark of redemption or rivalry. But what they captured instead was steadier. A black woman who had been called a gold digger standing at the helm of a company she once had to defend herself against. And instead of burning it down, she'd chosen to rebuild it. With grace, with courage, and with room for everyone inside. If this story moved you, share it. Somewhere, a woman is being called a gold digger for daring to want more, and she needs to see that success is the sweetest answer. Comment below if you've ever been judged for your ambition and proved that what they called greed was really vision. Gold digger. The words sliced through champagne and applause like glass. She'd just said yes, under chandeliers that made the night look like heaven on credit, and still, someone found a way to remind her she didn't belong. Brooklyn Moore didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just smiled because she'd already learned that silence in the right hands can be strategy. What no one knew was that the woman they whispered about wasn't chasing power. She was building it, and the same company that mocked her ambition would one day answer to her name. Stay with us, because what began as an insult ends in an empire. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated, called something you weren't, only to rise so high they had to say your name with respect? Under the chandeliers of the Marlowe, the light fell like diamonds melted into air. The room was a constellation of silk and champagne, executives, investors, and socialites dressed in money and opinions. At the center stood Brooklyn Moore, her skin glowing under the crystal light, her curls pinned back with a gold pin that shimmered every time she turned her head. The moment was perfect in theory, the kind of scene magazines crave. Miles Hill, tall and composed in a tailored navy suit, kneeling with a ring that caught the chandelier's fire. When she said yes, the room erupted into applause, glasses raised, flashbulbs erupting like tiny suns. Miles slipped the ring onto her finger, oval diamond, clean and deliberate, just like him, and whispered, "You've made me the luckiest man alive." Brooklyn smiled, but something inside her stayed still. She'd learned long ago that every dream realized came with a cost. As she leaned in to kiss him, the applause softened, but a single voice sliced through it, low, certain, almost intimate. "Gold digger." The syllables didn't echo. They sank, heavy and sharp. A few heads turned. Someone laughed awkwardly to cover it. Miles didn't hear. Brooklyn did. Her eyes flicked toward the sound, searching for the face attached to the venom, but it had already vanished back into the glittering crowd. She straightened, her spine regal, her smile serene. It was the kind of smile that said, "I see you, and I don't need to answer you." Miles took her hand, squeezing it gently, his own nervousness disguised as affection. "Ignore the noise," he whispered. "People will talk." She nodded, her voice silk-wrapped steel. "They always do." Later, as photographers guided them toward the balcony for the engagement shots, the city stretched below them, glass towers and quiet ambition. Brooklyn leaned against the marble railing, the cool air brushing her shoulders, and caught her reflection in the window. Elegant, composed, untouchable. But she knew the narrative had already started forming. The wealthy black woman with beauty, mystery, and ambition. Too much of all three. She'd seen it before, in meetings, in magazines, in whispers that wore expensive perfume. Miles kissed her temple, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. "You look like everything I've ever wanted," he said. She smiled again, this time softer. "Then let's make sure you know what that really means." When the flash went off, capturing them framed by the skyline, she tilted her chin slightly higher, not out of vanity but out of defiance. The word they'd thrown at her would not define her, not tonight, not ever. The hum inside Halberton Systems was a constant metallic rhythm, servers breathing, keyboards clicking, ambition pulsing through the glass walls. Miles moved through it like a conductor, sleeves rolled to the elbow, eyes scanning dashboards and deadlines. To outsiders, he was the calm in the chaos, the man who could turn panic into process. To those who worked with him, he was the company's spine, efficient, polished, and predictable. Halberton was a place where work was worship, and Miles had learned to kneel. Victoria Carlyle watched from her corner office, the city skyline reflected behind her like a crown. She was elegance sharpened into weaponry, her silver bob precise, her words even more so. "We're not just building software," she told her team during meetings. "We're building control." Miles admired her, even feared her a little. She had built an empire out of deadlines and diplomacy. To disappoint her was to risk invisibility, and Miles had worked too long to disappear now. In the break room that smelled faintly of burnt espresso, CFO Grant Whitford leaned against the counter, gold cufflinks winking beneath the fluorescent light. "Heard about the engagement," he said, smirking. "Brooklyn Moore, right? Quite the upgrade." Laughter rippled from the interns nearby, thin, nervous, performative. Grant continued, "Guess love really does appreciate and value." Miles looked up from his coffee, jaw tight. The words tasted like poison, but he swallowed them anyway. Halberton rewarded silence when silence protected its image. "Watch your numbers," Miles said evenly, his tone clipped, professional. "They're slipping." He walked away before Grant could respond, but the sting followed him down the hall. That evening, Brooklyn arrived at the office with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of presence that turned heads for reasons no one could name. Her pencil skirt was tailored, her eyes observant, her smile warm but calculated. She carried a leather sketchbook filled with ideas for a sustainability campaign, a personal passion she thought could complement Halberton's corporate responsibility wing. "You could pitch it to Victoria," Miles said, scanning an email without looking up. Brooklyn tilted her head, noting how his gaze stayed on the screen. Not her. "Could I?" she asked softly. "Or would it be better coming from you?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just aware. Brooklyn could read a room like weather, and this one was heavy with politics. As she walked past the glass walls, she felt eyes trail her, the same curiosity that had whispered gold digger now repackaged as polite interest. She turned back to Miles, her voice calm. One day, you'll have to decide which future you're building, Halberton's or your own." Then she kissed his cheek and left the scent of roasted coffee and warning in the air. The scent of gardenia and ink always reminded Brooklyn of where she began, Aunt Delilah's flower shop, where business wasn't taught in theory, but in survival. Above the shop, amid ledgers and lavender, she learned that money wasn't inherited but interpreted. Aunt Delilah used to say, "People don't fear numbers, baby. They fear what numbers reveal." Brooklyn took this to heart. Now, 2 decades later, she ran Moore and Maven Holdings, a private equity firm built on foresight rather than flash. While others chased the obvious, Brooklyn hunted value in forgotten corners, companies dismissed as too small, too messy, or too hard to scale. She found beauty in complexity and profit in the overlooked. Her office was minimal and serene, with light streaming through tall windows onto marble floors. Every surface was intentional, clean, modern, controlled. Yet beneath the calm hum of productivity, a new tension brewed. The whisper from the Marlowe had multiplied like an algorithm. Gold digger. The phrase had seeped into inboxes and timelines. Clients, once trusting, now began meetings with thin smiles and hesitant nods. One even joked, "Hope the merger's not just a marriage one." Brooklyn returned his laughter, smooth and professional, while her assistant quietly noted the man's name in her planner. She never defended herself publicly. She didn't need to. Instead, she adjusted the math. The next morning, her analysts received new directives. Divest from that client's fund and redirect capital to a promising biotech portfolio she'd spotted months earlier. Every insult carried a consequence. Never loud, just precise. By week's end, the blogger who had mocked her online received a polite cease and desist and a discovery notice that silenced the jokes overnight. At night, with the city glittering below her penthouse, Brooklyn sat with her sketchbook open beside a glass of Cabernet. Unlike Aunt Delilah's flowers, Brooklyn drew systems, flowcharts of influence, diagrams of cause and effect. People saw only polish, but her real power was patience. She didn't chase narratives, she rewrote them. Still, between the equations and the quiet, she thought of Miles. He excelled at strategy, but remained blind to shadows. He believed merit spoke for itself, never realizing how often voices like hers were discounted before they even spoke. Brooklyn closed her book and whispered to the night, "They can call me what they want. I'll call it leverage." When the city lights reflected in her wine glass, they resembled not stars but opportunities, waiting to be claimed. The bistro was all white linen and morning light, the kind of place where conversations sounded expensive. Brooklyn sat by the window, 2 menus folded neatly before her, watching the condensation slide down her water glass. Miles was late. Again. She didn't mind waiting. What unsettled her was the way he'd started arriving flustered, his attention parceled out between her and his phone. When he finally appeared, his tie slightly loosened. His apology came wrapped in distraction. "Victoria just pushed the product demo up a week," he murmured, eyes still flicking across a notification. "We're running behind." Brooklyn smiled, though her eyes stayed steady on him. "Seems like she owns more of your hours than you do." He barely had time to answer before a wave of laughter drew their attention. 3 Halberton executives entered, their presence as uninvited as it was inevitable. Grant Whitford spotted Miles first. "Hill!" he boomed, already steering the group toward their table. HR Chief Paige Larkin offered a sugary smile, and Penelope Vance, sleek, composed, a woman who turned civility into art, tilted her head. "We were just talking about your engagement," she said, eyes flicking toward Brooklyn. "Congratulations, truly. You must be thrilled, Brooklyn. Miles is finally upwardly mobile." The words floated like perfume, light but laced with venom. A soft hum of laughter followed, polite and cruel. Miles froze, his knuckles whitening around his glass. Brooklyn set hers down, every movement precise, deliberate. Her tone was silk, stretched over steel. "Upward is a direction," she said, "but it's not a value." The laughter died mid-breath, leaving the table heavy with something unspoken. Paige coughed into her napkin. Grant shifted his watchband. Penelope only smiled wider, the way predators do when prey refuses to run. Miles changed the subject, grasping for neutral ground, but the damage had already seeped into the fabric of the afternoon. Brooklyn continued her meal with poise so sharp it cut through the tension, her every bite measured, her silence eloquent. When the executives finally drifted away, Miles exhaled, a mix of shame and irritation coloring his voice. "They didn't mean it like that," he said quietly. Brooklyn looked up, her gaze calm and piercing. "The tragedy, Miles, isn't what they meant. It's what you accepted." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Outside, traffic hummed like static. Brooklyn reached for her purse, her hand brushing the engagement ring that still caught light like a promise she hadn't decided to keep. The silence between them wasn't angry, it was evaluative, a quiet audit of love and loyalty. Somewhere in the distance, the city moved on. But for Brooklyn, the math had already started. The story broke on a Wednesday morning, the kind of day that began with coffee and ended with damage control. "Brooklyn More bags a tech prince," the headline read, paired with a stolen photo from the Marlowe. Her hand on Miles's chest, the ring catching light like proof of guilt. The comment section bloomed with coded envy and casual cruelty. Social climber, strategic romance, pretty face, perfect timing. Brooklyn didn't flinch. She'd been called worse by better, but this time the sting wasn't in the words. It was in Miles's silence. By noon, Halberton's internal chat was buzzing. Screenshots circulated, the link passed from executive to intern with emoji commentary. Upstairs, behind closed glass, Victoria Carlyle held a board meeting about optics. Her voice was measured, her smile surgical. "Our people represent our principles," she said. "Right now, one of our leads is trending for the wrong reasons." Miles sat at the table, posture rigid, pulse unsteady. Grant Whitford leaned back in his chair, faux sympathy dripping from his tone. "She's beautiful, Miles, but perception is reality. Investors don't like uncertainty." When Victoria suggested postponing the engagement party for the sake of brand focus, all eyes turned to him. He hesitated, then nodded. The decision was clean, professional, and devastating. Brooklyn found out through a text, short and sterile. "Let's reschedule. It's just not the right time." She read it twice, then once more, each repetition stripping away warmth until only clarity remained. She didn't reply. Instead, she drove across the bridge to Aunt Delilah's apartment, a small sanctuary filled with plants, soft jazz, and the lingering scent of eucalyptus. They sat on the floor surrounded by candlelight and silence, two generations of women bound by resilience. Aunt Delilah poured tea, her hands still steady from decades of balancing ledgers and life lessons. "You look like you're thinking instead of feeling," she said finally. Brooklyn smiled faintly. "Feeling's expensive. Thinking pays better." Delilah reached out, touching her niece's hand. "Don't harden, baby. Just sharpen." Brooklyn stared at the flickering flames, the sound of rain tapping the windows like punctuation. Every drop was a reminder of patience, of strategy, of knowing when to let noise fade into clarity. The hurt didn't vanish. It reorganized. She breathed through it, slow and deliberate, until the ache turned to intention. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "They think this story defines me," she said. "But stories can be bought. Companies too, Delilah nodded, pride glinting behind her calm. In that moment, Brooklyn's heartbreak found direction, and pain became blueprint. Brooklyn spent the following week in quiet motion, her pain disguised as productivity. At Moore and Maven, her team learned long ago that when she fell silent, something significant was about to move. She closed her office door, slipped off her heels, and opened her laptop, not to read the gossip still orbiting her name, but to read Halberton Systems. Not its website, not its press releases, but its filings, contracts, and crumbs of truth buried beneath quarterly optimism. She dissected the company the way surgeons dissect mistakes, precisely, without sentiment. Halberton, she discovered, was as brittle as it was shiny. Its supply chain contracts were written with loopholes big enough to drive losses through. Their prized patent family, the one that supposedly held the future of logistics AI, was tangled in quiet litigation no one on the board had addressed. And their small data labeling subsidiary, acquired 3 years earlier to make them modern, was quietly bleeding engineers who hadn't been paid bonuses in months. It was a company running on fumes and pride, propped up by image and inertia. Brooklyn smiled faintly. Pride was always the first number to fall. That night she called Ezra Cole, her counsel, sharp, discreet, ex-corporate litigator who'd grown allergic to arrogance. "I need you to look into Halberton," she said simply. "Deeply." Ezra didn't ask why. He only said, "How soon?" Then came Zuri Banks, her operations ace, who could find inefficiencies in anything that breathed. "They think scale is their strength," Brooklyn told her. "But scale without soul is rot. Find me the rot." Finally, she brought in Kai Ramirez, a quiet analyst who'd once interned at Halberton before walking away with something more valuable than experience: insight. He still remembered which systems were failing, which executives cut corners, and which assets were quietly for sale. They met at midnight in Brooklyn's loft, the air thick with purpose. Laptops glowed over stacks of printouts, candles flickered like witnesses, and outside, the city murmured with distant sirens. "We're not circling wagons," Brooklyn said, scanning the spreadsheets. "We're circling opportunity." Zuri grinned. "And what's the target?" Brooklyn looked up, her eyes steady. "Not them." What they took for granted. As the night deepened, patterns began to emerge. Brooklyn saw the same carelessness she'd felt at that Halberton lunch, the entitlement of people too secure to imagine consequence. She made notes in the margin beside each vulnerability, not as threats, but as doors waiting to open. By dawn, the plan had shape. Halberton had spent years overlooking her. That was their first mistake. Their second would be underestimating what she could do in the dark. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.